The order had already been signed long before the first German armored columns rolled toward the Soviet defensive belts. By early July 1943, there was no practical way to reverse the decision. Months of preparation, the concentration of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and the assembly of thousands of tanks had committed both Germany and the Soviet Union to a confrontation unlike anything the Eastern Front had yet witnessed. The Kursk salient, a massive bulge projecting westward into German-held territory after the Soviet victories of the previous winter, had become the point where both armies expected the next decisive struggle. For Adolf Hitler, delaying the offensive had been a calculated gamble. Earlier plans called for striking the salient in the spring, before Soviet defenses could fully mature. Instead, the operation was postponed repeatedly while Germany waited for additional Panther tanks, Tiger heavy tanks, and Ferdinand tank destroyers to reach frontline units. The expectation was straightforward. Newer armored vehicles, superior firepower, and concentrated offensive power would restore the initiative that had been slipping away since the defeat at Stalingrad. Every delay, however, granted Soviet commanders precious time to transform the Kursk region into one of the strongest defensive systems ever constructed during the Second World War. The Soviet High Command had little doubt about Germany's intentions. Intelligence from multiple sources, including reconnaissance and intercepted information, suggested that the offensive would target the northern and southern shoulders of the salient. Rather than launching a preemptive attack, Soviet planners accepted a difficult choice. They would absorb the initial German assault, exhaust the attacking formations against prepared defenses, and then launch large-scale counteroffensives once German strength had been spent. It was a strategy that demanded patience, discipline, and an enormous confidence in defensive preparations. Across the battlefield, engineers, civilians, and soldiers worked continuously. Defensive belts stretched for remarkable distances. Minefields multiplied into the hundreds of thousands. Anti-tank guns were carefully positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Trenches, communication lines, concealed artillery positions, and reserve strong points formed successive layers intended to slow every German advance. Behind the front, armored reserves waited for the moment when local crises might become opportunities. As dawn approached on the 5th July 1943, the battlefield was already crowded with forces of unprecedented scale. German Army Groups Center and South prepared to attack from opposite directions, hoping to encircle Soviet forces. Inside the salient, Soviet formations stood ready behind their fortifications, expecting the blow rather than fearing it. The opening phase would not be decided by surprise. Both sides knew a massive battle was coming. When the first attacks finally unfolded, they represented more than another offensive on the Eastern Front. They marked the beginning of a contest in which preparation, industrial capacity, intelligence, and endurance would prove as important as battlefield courage. Once the assault began, neither command could easily withdraw without accepting consequences that extended far beyond the fields surrounding Kursk. The campaign had crossed the point where escalation was no longer a choice but an unavoidable reality. The coming clash at Kursk was not driven by a sudden opportunity. It emerged from months of strategic pressure that left both Germany and the Soviet Union believing they had little room to avoid another major confrontation. By the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front had become a struggle of endurance as much as maneuver, and every major decision was shaped by the consequences of the previous winter's disasters. Germany entered the campaign carrying the weight of Stalingrad. The surrender of the German Sixth Army had destroyed the image of unstoppable German expansion in the East. Allied governments took notice. Occupied populations found renewed hope, and the Red Army gained confidence from a victory that demonstrated the Wehrmacht could be decisively defeated. Hitler regarded the situation as more than a military setback. He believed Germany needed a clear offensive success to restore confidence within its own armed forces, reassure its allies, and convince both enemies and neutral nations that the Reich still possessed the ability to dictate events on the battlefield. The Kursk salient appeared to offer exactly that possibility. A successful double envelopment from the north and south promised to trap substantial Soviet forces, shorten German defensive lines, and recover the operational initiative. German planners argued that destroying Soviet reserves inside the salient could delay future Soviet offensives and stabilize the Eastern Front. Although opinions differed within the German High Command, many commanders accepted that some form of offensive action was necessary before Soviet military strength continued to expand beyond Germany's capacity to counter. The repeated postponements of Operation Citadel, however, revealed growing disagreements inside the German leadership. Several senior officers questioned whether waiting for additional armored vehicles justified allowing Soviet defenses to become stronger each week. Others off from the Coral Runway. Others believed the offensive should proceed immediately with available forces rather than surrender the advantage of surprise. Hitler ultimately chose delay, convinced that newly introduced Panther tanks and other modern armored vehicles would provide the decisive edge needed to break through Soviet positions. That assumption would become one of the campaign's most significant risks. On the Soviet side, political and military priorities aligned more closely than they had earlier in the war. Joseph Stalin had previously favored immediate offensive action whenever possible. But after extensive discussions with senior commanders, including Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, Soviet leadership accepted a different approach. Intelligence consistently suggested that Germany intended to attack the salient rather than withdraw from it. Instead of striking first, Soviet planners recommended allowing the German assault to collide with carefully prepared defenses before launching powerful counteroffensives against weakened enemy formations. This decision reflected more than confidence in defensive engineering. It demonstrated a growing maturity within Soviet operational planning. Factories east of the Ural Mountains continued producing tanks, artillery, aircraft, and ammunition at extraordinary rates, while new formations entered service faster than Germany could replace earlier losses. Soviet commanders believed time increasingly favored their side. Every week spent preparing defensive belts improved their chances of surviving the initial assault and preserving armored reserves for the decisive Gramarnessus phase that would follow. By early July, both governments had committed enormous political prestige and military resources to the coming battle. Neither leadership could easily cancel its chosen course without accepting serious strategic consequences. The decisions had already been made. The only uncertainty that remained was whether Germany's offensive momentum could overcome a defense deliberately designed to absorb it before striking back. Before a single armored spearhead attempted to penetrate the Soviet lines, The outcome of Operation Citadel was already being shaped by geography, logistics, and competing operational assumptions. Both commands had assembled forces on a scale rarely seen in military history, yet neither side believed sheer numbers alone would determine success. The battle would depend on whether carefully designed plans could survive contact with an enemy that had spent months preparing for exactly this confrontation. The Kursk salient extended deep into the German front, creating an opportunity that appeared attractive on operational maps. German planners intended to strike simultaneously from the north and the south, closing the gap behind the salient and trapping Soviet formations inside a massive encirclement. In the north, the offensive was assigned to the German 9th Army under Army Group Center. In the south, Army Group South committed powerful armored formations, including elite panzer divisions, in an effort to achieve a faster breakthrough. If both thrusts met according to plan, the Soviet forces occupying the salient would face isolation and destruction. The Germans committed thousands of armored vehicles, supported by artillery and aircraft, while introducing several new weapons, expected to restore battlefield superiority. Panther tanks entered combat for the first time in significant numbers. Tiger heavy tanks offered formidable armor and long-range firepower. Ferdinand tank destroyers mounted powerful guns capable of destroying Soviet armor at great distances. On paper, these weapons appeared capable of overwhelming defensive positions that had resisted earlier offensives. Yet technical superiority did not eliminate practical difficulties. Many newly delivered Panthers experienced mechanical failures before reaching combat or shortly after entering action. Maintenance units struggled to support unfamiliar equipment under battlefield conditions. Spare parts, recovery vehicles, and repair crews could not always keep pace with operational demands. Every disabled vehicle reduced the striking power available for the narrow breakthrough sectors on which the German plan depended. Across the front, Soviet commanders viewed the battlefield differently. Their objective was not to prevent every German advance. Instead, they intended to slow, weaken, and fragment each attacking formation before committing powerful reserves. Defensive belts stretched one behind another, often extending to remarkable depth. Minefields were arranged to disrupt armored momentum rather than simply destroy tanks. Anti-tank guns occupied concealed positions covering likely avenues of advance, while artillery batteries stood ready to engage German concentration. Identified through extensive reconnaissance, the terrain itself reinforced these preparations. Open farmland offered favorable conditions for armored maneuver, but the same landscape also exposed advancing columns to carefully coordinated defensive fire. Villages, streams, ridgelines, and patches of woodland became natural obstacles that defenders integrated into their planning. Rather than relying on a single defensive line, Soviet engineers created multiple zones designed to absorb repeated attacks. Even when German units captured an objective, another defensive position often waited beyond it. Logistics also favored the defenders. Soviet supply routes behind the salient remained comparatively secure, allowing ammunition, replacement troops, and armored reserves to move into threatened sectors. German forces, by contrast, depended upon maintaining the momentum of their offensive. Every delay increased fuel consumption, complicated resupply, and provided additional time for Soviet commanders to reinforce critical areas. The longer the battle continued, the the greater the strain placed upon Germany's offensive capability. Perhaps the greatest contrast lay in expectation. German planners believed concentrated armored strength could rupture Soviet defenses before reserves could intervene, preserving operational freedom for a rapid encirclement. Soviet commanders expected the opposite. They anticipated losing ground during the opening phase, but believed their layered defenses would exhaust German offensive power before decisive objectives could be reached. As the offensive began on the 5th of July 1943, both plans remained internally logical. Yet, beneath Germany's confidence, an increasingly visible weakness had emerged: the success of Operation Citadel. The success of Operation Citadel depended on achieving rapid breakthroughs with forces that could not afford prolonged attrition, while the Soviet defense had been deliberately structured to ensure exactly that kind of battle. The first advances would soon reveal whether speed or endurance would dominate the campaign. The opening artillery exchanges on the 5th of July 1943 did not produce the surprise that either side had once hoped to achieve. Soviet intelligence had anticipated the timing of the German assault with considerable accuracy, allowing defensive formations to prepare before the main attacks began. German forces nevertheless advanced according to plan, confident that concentrated armored power and close air support could still break through the layered defenses before Soviet reserves altered the balance. In the northern sector, the German Ninth Army attacked toward the southern edge of the Kursk salient. The offensive encountered immediate resistance. Minefields slowed armored columns, forcing engineers to clear narrow lanes while remaining exposed to artillery fire and anti-tank guns. Every pause disrupted carefully coordinated timetables. Tanks, infantry, and supporting vehicles that were intended to move together increasingly became separated. German commanders found themselves committing additional forces simply to maintain momentum through defensive positions that had been expected to fall much more quickly. The consequences extended beyond the front line. Artillery ammunition was consumed faster than anticipated. Engineering units suffered mounting losses while clearing obstacles, and damaged vehicles accumulated behind the advancing formations. Even where local breakthroughs occurred, Soviet defenders frequently withdrew only to occupy another prepared position farther back. Instead of collapsing, the defensive system absorbed repeated blows while steadily reducing the offensive strength available for the next assault. The situation unfolded differently in the south, where German armored formations achieved greater initial success. Powerful panzer divisions advanced through sectors defended by Soviet forces that yielded ground only after determined resistance. Villages changed hands more than once, and several defensive belts were penetrated. German commanders believed they were creating the conditions necessary for an operational breakthrough. Yet every kilometer gained required continuous fighting, and Soviet reserves increasingly appeared wherever German spearheads threatened to expand their success. The first major turning point emerged not from a dramatic single engagement, but from the cumulative effect of attrition. German armored formations had planned to preserve their strength for the decisive encirclement. Instead, they spent valuable combat power overcoming successive defensive lines. Mechanical failures continued to affect newly introduced Panther tanks, while mine damage and artillery fire steadily reduced operational numbers across multiple units. Recovery teams worked continuously, but many disabled vehicles could not immediately return to combat. The offensive remained active. Yet its striking power no longer matched the assumptions upon which Operation Citadel had been designed. At the same time, Soviet commanders resisted the temptation to commit every reserve immediately. Fresh formations entered battle only where German advances threatened critical sectors. This deliberate management of reserves prevented Lisments, local setbacks, from developing into operational collapse. The defensive concept was functioning largely as intended. Trade territory for time, while preserving enough combat power to challenge the exhausted attacker. As fighting intensified over the following days, air power contributed significantly to operations on both sides. German aircraft supported advancing armored columns and attempted to suppress Soviet artillery positions, while the Soviet Air Force increasingly contested control of the battlefield. Neither side achieved complete dominance in the air. Instead, aviation became another element of a wider contest in which logistics, endurance, and replacement capacity proved just as important as tactical success. Attention gradually shifted toward the southern approaches near Prokhorovka, where one of the campaign's most famous engagements would occur. German armored formations continued, pressing northward, hoping to exploit earlier gains before Soviet reserves fully assembled. Soviet commanders recognized that allowing the breakthrough to continue risked exposing the interior of the salient. Large armored formations were therefore committed to contain the advance before German units could achieve their operational objective. The fighting around Prokhorovka on the 12th July has often been remembered as the defining image of the Battle of Kursk. Popular accounts for decades described vast numbers of tanks charging directly into one another across open ground. Modern historical research presents a more complex picture. The engagement involved intense armored combat, fought at close range, under difficult conditions, but many long-standing claims regarding exact numbers and dramatic battlefield scenes remain disputed. What is well established is that both sides committed substantial armored forces in an attempt to seize or retain the initiative at a critical moment. The immediate consequence was not the decisive German breakthrough that Operation Citadel required. German units inflicted serious losses on attacking Soviet formations, but they failed to achieve the operational freedom necessary to continue the encirclement. Soviet attacks, despite suffering heavily, disrupted German plans and prevented the offensive from regaining the momentum lost during the earlier stages of the campaign. Tactical success in isolated sectors no longer translated into strategic advantage. The momentum from the Coral Runway. The momentum of the entire battle shifted as developments elsewhere on the Eastern Front placed additional pressure on German decision-making. On the 12th July, the same day fighting intensified around Prokhorovka, Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov against the German-held Oral salient north of Kursk. This new offensive threatened German positions beyond the immediate battlefield and forced the German High Command to reconsider its priorities. Continuing Operation Citadel now meant risking vulnerable sectors that required immediate reinforcement. At the same time, wider events beyond the Eastern Front demanded Hitler's attention. The Allied landings in Sicily had opened another major front, increasing pressure on Germany's already strained military resources. Armored divisions that might otherwise have remained committed to Kursk were suddenly needed elsewhere. The offensive from the Coral Runway. The offensive could no longer be evaluated solely by conditions on the battlefield surrounding the salient. Faced with mounting losses, losses, slowing advances, expanding Soviet offensives, and growing strategic commitments. The German leadership gradually abandoned the expectation that Operation Citadel could achieve its original objectives. Local fighting continued, and individual formations maintained determined resistance. But the opportunity for a decisive encirclement had disappeared. What had begun as Germany's attempt to regain the strategic initiative was ending as a prolonged struggle in which the attackers had exhausted the very offensive strength they had hoped would reverse the course of the war. By the middle of July 1943, the central objective of Operation Citadel had become unattainable. German forces had failed to seal the Kursk salient. The planned encirclement never materialized, and the offensive that was intended to restore Germany's strategic initiative had instead consumed many of its most capable armored formations. Although German units continued to fight effectively in numerous local engagements, the campaign no longer offered a realistic path toward the decisive victory envisioned during its planning stages. The immediate tactical outcome reflected a battle in which neither side escaped severe losses. Both Germany and the Soviet Union suffered substantial casualties in personnel and equipment. Historical estimates differ regarding the precise figures, and surviving records do not always agree, particularly concerning damaged vehicles later repaired and returned to service. What remains beyond dispute is the extraordinary scale of destruction. Thousands of armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and aircraft were committed during the wider Kursk campaign, while both armies paid a heavy human cost in killed, wounded, and missing. For Germany, however, the consequences extended far beyond numerical losses, replacing experienced tank crews, officers, and specialized maintenance personnel proved increasingly difficult. Even when factories produced new armored vehicles, they could not rapidly replace the combat experience lost during months of fighting on the Eastern Front. Mechanical failures that had affected several newly introduced during the offensive further complicated Germany's ability to recover. The expectation that advanced technology alone could compensate for shrinking manpower and industrial disadvantages appeared increasingly unrealistic. The Soviet Union faced its own enormous burden. Entire formations required rebuilding after the fighting, and many armored units had suffered heavy attrition during repeated counterattacks. Yet Soviet industry continued producing tanks, artillery, ammunition, and aircraft on a scale that increasingly outpaced German production. Reinforcement systems remained capable of restoring combat strength more rapidly than Germany could replace comparable losses. This growing industrial advantage became one of the defining realities of the war's later stages. Even before the fighting around Kursk had completely subsided, Soviet forces seized the initiative across broader sectors of the Eastern Front. Operation Kutuzov pressed against German positions around Orel, while another major offensive, Operation Rumyantsev, targeted the Belgorod-Kharkiv region, instead of regrouping for another large offensive. German formations found themselves reacting to successive Soviet attacks. Operational momentum had shifted decisively. This change marked more than the conclusion of a single campaign. From the end of Operation Citadel onward, Germany never again launched a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front, comparable in scale or ambition. Local counterattacks and offensive for defensive operations continued for the remainder of the war, but the Wehrmacht increasingly fought to delay Soviet advances rather than dictate the tempo of the conflict. Yet the strategic picture remained unresolved. The Red Army had secured the initiative, but the road to Berlin still stretched across vast distances defended by experienced German forces. Years of hard campaigning, immense logistical challenges, and further, costly offensives still lay ahead before the outcome that had begun to take shape at Kursk could be fully realized. The Battle of Kursk did not end the war on the Eastern Front, nor did it immediately destroy Germany's military power. German formations remained disciplined, dangerous, and capable of conducting effective defensive operations for nearly 2 more years. Yet the campaign marked a measurable shift in the balance of initiative. After the failure of Operation Citadel, Germany never again attempted a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front, comparable in scale or purpose. From that point forward, the Wehrmacht increasingly reacted to Soviet operations rather than forcing the Red Army to respond to its own. The campaign also reshaped military thinking. Earlier German victories had often relied on rapid armored breakthroughs, deep penetrations, and large encirclements that overwhelmed opponents before they could reorganize. At Kursk, those methods encountered an opponent that had deliberately prepared to absorb such attacks. Successive defensive belts, carefully coordinated artillery, extensive minefields, and the controlled commitment of operational reserves demonstrated that modern defense could significantly reduce the effectiveness of even highly experienced armored forces. The battle became an important case study in the relationship between offensive mobility and defense in depth. For the Soviet Union, Kursk reinforced confidence in a style of warfare that combined intelligence, industrial production, engineering, and operational planning. Soviet commanders had resisted the temptation to launch premature attacks, instead allowing German forces to expend strength, prepared positions before initiating their own offensives. The campaign showed a level of coordination that reflected how much the Red Army had evolved since the catastrophic defeats of 1941. Lessons learned during Kursk influenced subsequent operations as Soviet forces advanced through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and eventually into Germany itself. The battle also illustrated the growing importance of industrial capacity in modern warfare. Germany continued developing advanced armored vehicles and powerful weapons, but increasingly struggled to replace experienced crews, maintain complex equipment, and sustain prolonged offensive campaigns. The Soviet Union, despite suffering immense losses, possessed a production system capable of replacing equipment and rebuilding formations on a scale that Germany found increasingly difficult to match. Kursk highlighted that battlefield success depended not only on tactical skill, but also on the ability to sustain military operations over time. Historians continue to examine aspects of the campaign in greater detail. Estimates of casualties vary among sources, while debates remain regarding the precise effectiveness of individual weapons, the significance of particular engagements, such as Prokhorovka from the Coral Runway, and whether Operation Citadel might have produced different results had it been launched earlier. These discussions reflect the complexity of reconstructing one of the largest military operations of the Second World War, rather than uncertainty about its broader outcome. The surviving documentary record continues to expand as archives have become more accessible. Beyond operational lessons and strategic consequences lies the human cost. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought across fields that were transformed into vast defensive systems, many never returning home. entire communities in the Kursk region. Endured occupation, destruction, and prolonged reconstruction, long after the armored formations had moved westward. Today, that history remains visible in a specific and verifiable way. The Prokhorovka battlefield memorial complex stands near one of the campaign's most studied sectors, preserving the landscape where the largest armored campaign in history reached its decisive turning point.